Thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you coming all the way.
Nice to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
From what I researched, it seems like you have done an in-depth analysis of Eastern versus Western views on the nature of consciousness. Can you share what stood out for you the most? Like, what were some of the similarities and differences you noticed?
Well, I'll start actually with, I think the main frame is whether consciousness is this abiding principle of the universe, or if consciousness is more associated with the contents of consciousness. So more specific to thoughts and emotions without this underlying reality of being. So that, I think, is the main difference that we're looking for. How can those two points of view dialogue with each other? And intersecting points, mostly I looked through the lens of Jungian-oriented depth psychology, so the lens of Carl Jung, and compared him with Patanjali. And there are definitely some points of intersection. One key one is Jung was very concerned with the reconciliation of science and religious experience. That's what he was after. And in the Orthodox Hindu system of thought, science and religion are merged. There was no schism like we have in Euro-American culture in the Enlightenment, where science and religion became actually very separated from each other. So in the Orthodox Hindu system of thought, science and religion are working beautifully together. So that idea of the religious function of the psyche is one, a yoga certainly addresses that, and that's what Jung was after through a Western framework. So that's one main area. Affect as an empirical means of entering the psyche. So what is our affect pointing to, whether it be sorrow or joy? So the affect also is a place of alignment. Those are two key areas.
And some people may not be familiar with Patanjali. Can you give a little bit of his background and what was his take on consciousness as well as unconsciousness?
Yeah, so Patanjali is interesting because, at least in the academic literature, there's not much known about him, and some researchers feel that Patanjali is actually more than one person, that system of thought was compiled by several people, and that book put together, some people feel, actually over the course of more than 1 century. So like the first 3 chapters came from one period of time and the 4th chapter came from another. So Patanjali himself is very enigmatic. Not much is known about him, but I really feel like the book can stand on its own. It's really beyond one person, and the whole Upanishadic tradition has come up through, hundreds of years of different yogis turning inward and doing an exploration of the interiority of their mind and their body. So I feel that as a compilation, even that text really does stand on its own.
And he was from which time period? 200 BC?
Well, that's right. So in the body of scholarship, they surmise probably around 200 to 300 of the current era. But again, that's like the greatest consensus. Some people date him 500 years before that to the time of the Buddha almost. And some people date at least the 4th chapter is later than that. But yes, the main consensus is about 200 or 300 of the current era.
And what was for you, what was the major takeaway about his view on consciousness? It sounds, from what I read, it sounds like he sees consciousness as the main reality off of which everything else emerges.
That's right. Consciousness as the reality of being. And then his book is basically a system of practices. He puts the whole philosophy together. The whole psychology philosophy gets really, I feel it's clearly delineated. The more and the longer that you study the text, the text can be very confronting when you first look at it, because there's only 195 lines, and each line definitely has to be unpacked. But the more time that we spend with it and do our own meditation practice and learn our own mind-body system and how we sit inside the cosmos, I feel like Patanjali's knowledge base, the way that he sees the world, becomes more and more clear. And really, consciousness, in his book, he uses the terms seer and perceiving interchangeably. He also uses Atman, which is a very common non-dual term. Atman equals Brahman. Brahman isn't mentioned at all. Patanjali uses the term Purusha, and that stands for pure consciousness, but he also uses the term the seer interchangeably with Purusha and Atman. So, and he makes two categories. He uses the categories of Sankhya, which is on first sight, looks like Patanjali has a really dualistic framework, but it's a dualistic metaphysics that are falsifiable. So he has Purusha as pure consciousness, the seer, and then he talks about Prakriti, the seen, which is more the contents of consciousness. And that's really anything, any subtle thought, any subtle emotion, anything that can be perceived for Patanjali is put in the category of Prakriti. He never uses the term unconscious. Actually, the research that I've read way back at the time of, I believe it's the Rig Veda, there were 5 times unconscious was mentioned, and then that term actually becomes obsolete. And there's a term, avidya, which really means, so vidya is wisdom, and again, in this system of thought, wisdom and perception go hand in hand. So avidya is not wisdom or not being able to see. So Patanjali, and I feel like that's a brilliant move pedagogically. So in order to teach people, it's a brilliant move not to use that term, because if consciousness is the reality of being, and it's singular and absolute from an ontological perspective, from beingness, then the cosmos or the world, reality, can never actually go unconscious. So to stop using that word and to use something like avidya, which is non-wisdom, I think was a stroke of genius, really, because we use conscious, unconscious in the West, and it can become, and it has become, very confusing.
And how does Jung use those words? It seems like he talks a lot about archetypes as well as concepts like collective unconscious. So it seems like he dwells a lot, like for him, consciousness and unconsciousness, they are like two separate concepts.
Yes, so Jung's frame of the alleviation of suffering, and again, that's another place of meeting, right? Both these systems of thought, both the Jungian system of thought and Patanjali's, are aiming for the amelioration of human suffering. So that's, again, another place of intersection. And so Jung's process, if you will, the process of individuation, is about bringing unconscious contents into consciousness. Now, again, both systems of thought, we could say, are concerned with bringing what we are unaware of into awareness. And when I use the term awareness, I'm using it more on the human level, what us as human beings are aware of. So Jung's path was called individuation, about bringing unconscious contents into consciousness. And for him, the collective unconscious, that was ontically real. That and the ego, for Jung, end up being real, that we as human beings are bringing consciousness to the Creator, consciousness into the darkness, as he says, of mere being. So for him, consciousness is something that's related to a human ego, and that as human beings bring the unconscious material into consciousness, then we are bringing consciousness to the world. So it's very, very different than Patanjali's view on consciousness.
And I didn't really clearly understand what Carl Jung means by archetypes. And collective unconsciousness. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Sure. It's a great place to look, actually, because the archetypes are another place where we can begin to see a means of crossing the bridge between Jung and Patanjali, or perhaps between all of Euro-American culture and Eastern systems of liberatory thought. So it's a great point to dialogue about. So archetype, the word in itself, the etymology of the word, archetypos, means primordial imprint. Jung's main concern, really, again, the reconciliation of science and religious experience. So the main archetype of concern in his system of thought is the archetype of the self, capital S self. And Jung, when he speaks to archetypes, he's clear to note that the archetypal image will change over time, and it will change between cultures. But the archetype as such, that imprint, it's made at the beginning of time. So it's imprinted in the species regardless of time and place. So it's sitting at the core, if you will, of the human psyche. One way to try to get to this idea, Jung uses other animal species to try to drive this point home. So he'll speak about how a chick breaks out of the shell of its egg, or how an eel can find its way to Bermuda. He also speaks of the leaf-cutting ant. And in order for the leaf-cutting ant to live out its life, if you will, and to tap into the instinctual aspects of its lived world, it needs the leaf. It needs its other ants. It needs the tree, the cutting, the transport. So he's trying to draw a picture in this archetype as such, in the archetype of the God image, that the Buddha can appear in India. Christ can appear in the Middle East. So different people can pop up in different cultures across time, but there's an imprint that's informing a move towards the highest level of, well, what Patanjali would call brahmacharya, living in the awareness of highest reality, living in the awareness of Brahman. So Jung is actually pointing to that. Even though his self is different than Patanjali's self, and that's another point we could dive into deeper, this archetype as such, tell me if you're like understanding, or if there's more questions, like I can keep unpacking that for you, because he shows it as something, again, that's beyond time, beyond culture, and that it's in all of us, that this instinct, the religious instinct, the religious function of the psyche, one could say, again, one of Jung's main arguments is for the reconciliation of science and religious experience. So he's trying to show this instinctual form, if you will, this instinctual, hold this term very lightly, form or structure, but imprint, obviously. He's trying to show it at the base of the psyche, and it's like informing how the psyche moves towards, for him, it's towards wholeness. And again, there'll be some argument in there for sure. I can see if, Jung and Patanjali were still alive, because for Patanjali, it's like, this whole thing's here right now. We are whole. And if you miss that point, you're going to be in a particular silo of thought that's going to be in epistemology, you're going to be building knowledge. And I think we can see that in the ivory tower, the academy. It's all building knowledge. But if it's, Patanjali would argue, but if it isn't rooted in this wholeness already, in the fact that consciousness is our being, then that system of thought can spiral you further and further away from that imprint or the roots. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's kind of reinforcing that duality with more and more concepts and knowledge and living in that circle of knowledge.
That's right, yeah. Living in this particular silo that just becomes like an echo chamber of human beings are the holders of consciousness. And of course, the more, I think we can see this all around us, the more we put our species as superior and the holders of consciousness, the more the earth seems to deteriorate around us, the more other species are going extinct. As we keep materialistically grabbing, making things so disposable, more, and not revering everything around us, all sentient beings and the planet herself, as equal in that carrier of consciousness.
And it seems like a lot of Eastern religion, that's the main aspiration, to shift that center of gravity from the ego to pure consciousness. How does that look like in Western religion or Western mysticism, this aspect of shifting consciousness?
Well, now Jung himself never lays his ego at the floor of Eastern thought, so to speak. In the end, he turns towards alchemy to help embellish his ideas on individuation and wholeness. I don't know about embellish, but definitely bring more substance too. But we have obviously lots of mystics, lots of spiritual people that have come up through Christianity, and so you can see that oneness for sure in the teachings of Master Eckhart, for sure. The surrender, I would have to say, is perhaps what it is that you're asking about. This idea of, and Patanjali again, I go back to him often because I feel his psychology is so logically consistent and so strong. In his Eightfold Path, his first limb, the yamas, he speaks to non-stealing, non-greed, non-violence. When the ego wants to hold any kind of level of superiority over the totality, it's a theft of sorts that ultimately we never get away with, but we can try to pretend and play it out on ourselves. So in the end, there can be no the only people we're playing the game against is ourselves. There can be no falsification in the end, because, if you will, I don't want to talk in pure transcendental terms, but the world behind our eyes, beneath, beyond, between. The preposition becomes really struggly there, but the world behind our eyes, let's just say that for now. It knows exactly what it's doing. Consciousness, conscire, to know with. The knowing is structured in it. So the moment we try to egoically hold, now that's when we're gonna lose our balance a little bit. And that's what's brilliant about yoga. Again, the physical postures are like a metaphor for the psychology. So when we're on our mats and we become imbalanced, it's the same as losing our psychic balance. So through Western religions, the same holds, that level of surrendering into. Christ himself was a mystic, right? And he taught me and my Father are one, which is virtually saying Atman equals Brahman. He was a yogi really in and of itself. So that, yes, having the ego check itself at the door of that moment of walking through the gateless gate or surrendering. And it's not that we don't have a functional organizing principle. We definitely want to make that clear, because I think that's where people struggle, between this idea of the East with the dissolution of the ego and the West saying, no, the ego is the seat of consciousness. Saying it's the seat of consciousness, to me, is part of the problem. it's the seat of a reflective consciousness, but not seat of consciousness. Saying it's the seat is that impulse to grab and take ownership of it. We do want a functional organizing principle. You cannot do yoga if you can't discern. The highest level of discernment are done through yoga. But Patanjali's basically just saying, just don't take ownership of that I am. You can say I am, but don't take ownership of it. The moment you begin to take ownership of it is the problem. So,
what do you think is the key aspect in transforming one's consciousness? If one pursues this exploration and they are keen about transforming their consciousness, how do they go about it? Does Patanjali and Carl Jung have some suggestions?
Oh, lots of suggestions. So now, just through my own terminology, what we're really transforming is perception, right? So yes, this is where it gets tricky to articulate. So consciousness is the reality of being. So we're watching nothing but the transformation of consciousness. I think it might be a bit more to the point to say people want to transform their suffering into liberation, or transform their bound world into a whole heal world. Or again, why I use human awareness for that. Like they want to open up their awareness so they're not bound inside patterns of suffering. Mm-hmm. And yeah, yoga offers many different tools for that. Carl Jung does. Shadow work, again, would be a great meeting place, which means we do the internal turn to look inside of our own psyche to see, well, really, where do we fall into chaos, or where are we rigid? Because ultimately what we're looking for is the flow of integration. We're looking to integrate East and West. We're looking for bilateral integration between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere, between the mind and the body, between the immanent and transcendent, right? If integration is what I want to say we're looking for, because again, wholeness is already what we are. So something happens in the way that we know the world, again, in the category of epistemology. It's happening somehow in how we are trying to attempt to know the world. So again, shadow work and Patanjali, yoga go hand in hand. Jung's shadow work and Patanjali's yoga go hand in hand to start to look inside, for sure, that internal turn of what are, the contents of my consciousness.
And along that lines, I wanted to ask about this idea of liberation from suffering. There seems to be different opinions about it from different teachers. Like one perspective is that nothing really changes, you just change your perspective and you're okay, you have okayness with whatever is going on, but nothing really changes in your outer world. And another perspective is like you have developed enough where you are able to transform your outer world. You are able to, you're not forced to watch a horror movie on the screen. You can change the movie that's playing on the screen. So there are two different views where one seems to suggest that we don't have free will in changing anything that's happening, whereas the other one suggests that we have to gain mastery. It's kind of like a journey of self-mastery to be able to transform your outer world. What are your thoughts on that?
100%, it's a journey of self-mastery, 100%. However, the question of what is the self is again going to arise there. So that mastery process is extremely relational. And one would have to turn off the TV and turn off all of the news feeds not to see suffering as it goes throughout the system of cultures. So to me, I don't know if this is what we're talking about, but yes, free will, that healing use of choice becomes all important at every level. That's part of the mastery process. But if non-duality is non-duality, and you and I are one, and I know my humanity through knowing your humanity, or we reflect our humanity back to each other, we can't ignore the big cultural pieces that sit under the comfort that we're in the Western society to even do this work of internal shadow work. Because the cultural pieces become extraordinarily important at some point, especially if we live in a culture that goes around the world to plunge other people of their natural resources. You see what I'm saying? If the culture is perpetuating suffering in other places, and I just sort of sit in my home. So non-duality means you and I are one, as well as I am one with the cosmos, or, you know, Atman equals Brahman. It means we're all one with the earth. So peace can be had through the self-mastery process, taking a comfortable seat in the body, really feeling the joy of being alive, joyful participating in the sufferings of the world, so to speak. But that participation has to come into the cultural level, because if I'm in a more wealthy nation that provides me the opportunity of meditating for periods of time, or, you know, some level of comfort, but my comfort is based off of a culture that has plundered other lands or gone and extracted the value from the land and other places around the earth, I have to be very, very aware of that. Otherwise, non-duality completely breaks down. So there is a huge social justice component to the work of yoga. And that isn't necessarily in Patanjali, although it is. There's one sutra where that's really clear, that if you are participating in, let's just say, an environment where somebody else is causing suffering, you have to be aware of that. But in the Hindu system of thought, definitely you see that in the Bhagavad Gita with Krishna's teachings to Arjuna. You have to participate in the social justice element.
This also kind of points to the aspect of how this unfoldment can bring everything under the rug to the surface, because this is not like escapism. This is, in fact, like a lot can come to surface.
That's right.
Because sometimes, like, spirituality can be seen as though, like, some people are trying to spiritualize their way out of suffering and try to pack everything in like spiritual stories to console themselves. But it's actually the opposite, where you have to see things as they are, and everything comes to surface.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Everything comes up to the surface, and then it's very relational. So how am I relating to each thing that comes up to the surface? Well, I'm changing the screen out there. Well, for sure, again, it's mastery of the internal system. So the understanding of my own mind-body connection. Again, remember earlier how I said affect was a place where Jung and Patanjali definitely meet each other. How does that raw core affect work within my own body? And to me, that's the brilliance of affective neuroscience that's helping us with a scientific psychology. There's neuropsychoanalysis that's come forward that's showing actually that the brainstem is inherently conscious, or the cortex derives its consciousness from the brainstem. So again, now we're back in the contents, but it's this idea that the body knows, that the body is sending its information up into the right hemisphere of the brain, and that our affects, our feelings, our, maybe we could say, the integration highway. Like, we have to understand how that works with us. So if you see shots or images of suffering children, or refugees, or any kind of disaster, especially a human-made disaster, obviously environmental as well, then do I react with absolutely no affect? Where's my compassion? Where's my empathy? Where's my resonance to my fellow human beings? And that ends up, I think, being a really crucial part. Like, non-duality isn't about spiritual bypass. If there's too much linkage early on, then you don't have enough differentiation. And that differentiation, that's what Patanjali does. He differentiates to link. And so I believe that people who speak to spiritual bypass, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about either an excessive linkage or a dissociated differentiation. That somehow you've come into certain aspect of the psyche and you've dissociated the rest of it, and whether it be the cultural piece or not, but the cultural piece has to come up and through. Because as you said, we go deeper and more material comes forward.
And what do you think is the potential of this transformation of consciousness? Where can one take this to? Like, is it just about healing your suffering, or are there some more unfoldments that can happen?
I definitely feel that mastering our own mind-body system first. I'm not saying at the expense of anything else, like definitely, again, these relational pieces. And you really, mastery only comes through relationship. You can go, I don't know, sit in a hut for 10 years, but if you can't come out of that hut and then like relate to your mother or the culture that you came from, find an entry point, well, what have you gained? You've maybe, again, gained something in that vertical connection, but the horizontal connection has yet to be made. So yes, we want to master, for sure, our own mind, body, like I said, the emotional world, the nerve. Am I regulated? Have I gone into dysregulation? Have I gone into chaos or rigidity? Or am I still in the flow of integration? For sure. And then from there, again, it ends up being, to me, more of a cultural piece, that as we each do that work, and again, remember, we're talking about differentiation and linkage, as we each do that work and then we link up as healed, or at least, I don't know what the percentage would be, healed enough, and then we link back together, then we have an opportunity to change what's on front of the screen. That's what I would say.
And it seems like sometimes the importance of taking small steps is lost, because sometimes when people are presented with the idea of liberation or enlightenment, people assume that now I'm going to know everything and I'm going to be all-knowing. But it's like small steps where even if if you are aware about your own body and you can heal your own body, even that is like a major step forward. So taking smaller steps is kind of important, because otherwise it looks very intimidating when that idea is presented, that of enlightenment or liberation. So it's okay to have like a progressive, small.
Definitely. I'm not actually even keen on the term enlightenment. I think it's so overplayed and so misunderstood. I much prefer the idea of realization, because it's that, the ahas come through and I keep realizing more. I'm like, oh, right. Now I'm in touch with a deeper level of myself. That's what that emotion, or that's what that anxiety was driving me towards or away from for so long. So I love the term realization, right? When we talk about the big sweeps, to me that's the ontological point, that the West or Euro-American academies need to really come to terms with why pure consciousness is so absent in the whole European canon. Why? That's a main, big, sweeping argument. And that's a cultural piece. I think that's really hard to place on the individuals within the culture. I think the idea of shadow work and the work, aiming towards healing of our own suffering is something we can each do individually. And as we do little bit by little bit of that, and we have the realizations and the aha moments, it becomes more clear. Wow, this thing knows exactly what it's doing, and we're held within it. But again, the cultural piece would be the big piece. The bit by bit, I think that's more on the individual level. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's a really interesting question you brought up. Where, what do you think is your opinion on why do you think consciousness or the concept of pure consciousness is lost in the Western, Western mysticism?
Well, actually, I would say it's more lost in the Western Academy, and I haven't studied enough of Western mysticism to know per se. So maybe we should hold this whole conversation really lightly and dance lightly as we talk about it. But my hunch is it goes back to this schism between science and religious experience, or science and religion, right? There's a whole contingent of orthodox science practitioners who almost pathologize religious experience, right? So it's not folding in these ideas of liberation or pure consciousness because, again, it's more of an egoic idea of what consciousness is, that we're going to build knowledge because we're these great knowing humans. And I don't want to disparage our species. We are great knowing creatures, but it's because the knowledge is already structured within the whole thing. And so anytime we try to have knowledge or more power over, we're going to start to fail ourselves, fail the culture, fail the species at large. So that would be my hunch, is that schism between science and religion has probably left pure consciousness more to the sidelines.
And another side to it is like looking at this kind of knowledge as orthodox or primitive kind of a knowledge and dismissing it.
And Jung was actually guilty of that. He thought that, ironically, like Buddha and Patanjali, that Eastern intuition had overreached itself, and that samadhi didn't actually bring greater awareness to it. It actually brought one into unconsciousness. He just could not relate to this idea that consciousness isn't only associated to an ego. So he's definitely, I would say, a bit guilty of seeing yoga as something more primitive, and that the West was going to come up with their own yoga.
I also wanted to ask about your take on Patanjali's work on siddhis or some of the mysterious phenomena. Can you talk a little bit about that? Are those kind of things possible?
I actually love, so that would be the third chapter of his text. So the first chapter, he kind of gives a lay of the land. The second chapter, it's a lot of the practices. And he has his eightfold path at the end of the second chapter, which, let's list them for your viewers, because it's a really great path. So it's the yamas, and yama really means the end. And but it's his first limb, and limbs, because it's like, as a baby grows in a womb, like all the limbs are growing at the same time. So even though holding loosely, we can think of them as steps, really all these limbs can be practiced at the same time. So the first one is the yamas, and it's really, to me, I love that he opens up his eightfold path that way. So these yamas are non-violence, truthfulness, non-stealing, brahmacharya, which is walking in the awareness of the highest reality. Being celibate really is the way that's often translated, but it just means staying in that awareness, and non-greed. And then the next limb is the niyamas, which really means to begin. So the beginning really is the end there, because pure consciousness is not violent to itself. The truth is sitting in it. It can't steal from itself. It's always in the awareness of its highest reality. It's not going to be greedy on itself. So the genius of having that as the first limb. The second limb, to begin, niyama, purity. Going to reflect purity back to itself. Contentment. And then he has tapas, which really means sitting in the fire of purification, being willing to sit in the pain of what the process is of purification. Then he talks about study of scripture and study of self, and then Ishvara Pranidhana, which is surrender. That's the surrender point. And then he has asana, pranayama, the physical postures, the breath work, then pratyahara, which is sense withdrawal. And then the last three limbs, that's how he starts the third chapter, which is the Vibhuti-pada, which is what you're pointing towards, those cities. And those last three limbs of that Eightfold Path are concentration, meditation, and absorption. So again, he ends the second chapter with this idea of sense withdrawal. He opens chapter 3, which is Vibhuti-pada, with this idea of samyama, which is concentration, meditation, and absorption all working together. In this chapter, Patanjali speaks to the cosmos. He speaks to the pole star and knowing, basically astrology. He puts our mind in absorption into the cosmic mind. And that's where the different set of powers come forward. It's not egoic black magic. It's no, your power, the true power, is now once you've absorbed yourself into cosmic mind. And because otherwise, if somebody argues they have those kind of powers, I just kind of laugh and I'm like, well, can you make the earth rotate differently on its axis? It's that idea. We're sitting in a cosmos. So again, non-stealing. We can't try to inflate and claim some kind of powers that we don't have or that aren't there. So I love that chapter, and I think it speaks to clairvoyance and clairaudience and absolutely the ability to hear and see on a deeper level. But the beauty is, it's from the perspective that one is now merged inside cosmic mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and from that perspective, some of these things don't seem like it's easier to explain things like psychic abilities, because if everything is one and connected, you can access some information that's pertaining to you. But usually in mainstream, some of the things we see, it seems more like ego-based. It seems like someone may claim to be really psychic and everything, but it's still coming through the filter of the ego. So that is also happening. It's rare to find that example of like merging into the cosmic mind and being able to access these abilities. What do you think?
Yeah, and again, Patanjali is really quite clear on this, and I love that, because certainly there are psychics who are continuing on their healing journey. They are picking up psychic phenomena, but they're not necessarily healed. And so, again, in this second chapter, that's where Patanjali speaks to the asana, and he speaks about taking the comfortable seat in the body beyond the duality. That's where he's talking about pranayama and breath control. Without that regulation of the nervous system, without that, to me, that's where you're going to see the dissolution of an ego. Because in order to have my system regulated, I can't be violent, I can't be trying to steal and take ownership, more ownership than just this one system needs for its own flow. So that's why he sets up chapter 2 with all those practices to make sure, I would say, to make sure that those ideas are well solidified, that your breathing and your body are completely linked. And more than that, he speaks to affect there because he talks about taking a comfortable seat. He does use the term joy, but that's the spectrum for yoga and the Brahmatic tradition. Suffering and joy, the ability to participate in the suffering of the world, but you've got to get your body completely aligned in order to most, if I could use the word fiercely, confront it or be with it or address it. It's Kali Ma in the end. In many ways, when we start talking about social justice, it's like, so there's a fierceness to it. So again, that's chapter 2. Chapter 3, he's in the cosmic mind. I think there is, I think you can see that's why he put one after the other. Again, even though I said hold those steps loosely and think about it as limbs, I think you can see why he follows the progression that he does, for sure. Because, again, and he warns people, I think it's in chapter 3, it might be chapter 4, it's like, don't get all excited about these psychic abilities. This isn't what you're looking for, ultimately. This is just more phenomena. Sure, it's clairaudience, clairvoyance. Again, it's of a psychic nature. But don't rest on your laurels there in the sense that, again, you don't want the ego to then co-opt again and have any sense of individual reification. It's, you want to start to use those powers more. Really, Patanjali's vision is holographic. It's, again, it's I am you and you are me. And he's asking us to meet through the heart center, if anything. And that's in the 3rd chapter too, where he talks about when you concentrate. So again, it's samyama, concentration, meditation, and absorption. He says when you practice samyama on the heart center, then you'll know the mind.
And is it possible to improve the quality of your intuition as you cleanse more of your egoic tendencies?
I would say they're part and parcel of the same thing. That's what's the brilliance of the logical consistency of this system of thought is there really is no alternative. As we each do the work to regulate our nervous system, to pull back whatever phenomena is on the forefront that's causing the suffering, whether it be cultural or familial, whatever it is, that we each do that work. And as you surrender into the field, and that's the brilliance, to me, of Jung saying this archetype, whatever we need in the West to understand that you can surrender into this place, Jung opening the doorway to that, I should say, then there's pure consciousness has no alternative but to show itself. It's showing itself really in the degradation of the planet. You steal from your home, you will have no home left. I am conscious. I am Shiva. I am here. I am informing all of this. And if we don't all understand that, right, that conscious that I am, right, that consciousness is informing all of it, then we're left with the struggle of materialism and perhaps the loss of our habitat because it was an egoic fight with a power that was way greater than egoic power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I'm curious about Carl Jung's take on this. How does he see the holographic model as well as like some of these mysterious phenomena?
Now, holography wasn't something Jung ever referred to, but where he does meet Patanjali really closely with psychic phenomena is through his theory of synchronicity. So he never completed that theory, but it definitely was one of the strongest. And you know, lots of people who followed after him, Louise von Franz, definitely said, you know, this is a point that we want to keep looking at. This is a really rich point of research. So this idea that, well, in a lot of Jung's research papers, he speaks to it as if it's almost like a special occurrence, that synchronistic moments sort of pop through at special moments. He did say, though, I believe it's in Collected Works 8, that if we do find that the soul and the mind and the body are all one, that he would have to revision the theory. That it wasn't just happening in like these special moments popping through, that synchronicity really would be the lay of the land. And that's what Patanjali points to. And Jung himself came, actually, his mother was known to have psychic abilities. His cousin was a medium. Actually, Jung did his dissertation on his cousin, who was a medium. So psychic phenomena were definitely something that always informed his psychology and his research, for sure. So it played a part all the way through, and especially I think you can see it in his theories of synchronicity.
And on a practical level, how do you think we can use some of these abilities in real life to improve the quality of life?
The most basic, I would say, because again, we don't want to make it too abstract or too otherworldly. It starts with the idea, and we have this now in science, like the mirror neurons, that really we're picking up a lot from each other, right? That we're mirroring each other back and forth. But what's beyond that mirroring is the resonance, the empathy, compassion, maybe, I don't know, we could say is the greatest psychic ability of all. That, again, if in chapter 3, where Patanjali speaks to concentration, meditation, absorption, the samyama into the heart center, then you'll know the mind. That ability to become one with all of humanity, compassion itself, again, hold that really loosely, but could loosely be termed some kind of psychic ability, that I really have gotten to the place of non-duality, and now I'm, here being with. So that for sure, compassion I think is much needed in order for us to help ourselves, self-compassion, and then compassion for each other. Beyond that, I don't know how helpful they are as far as healing, except to say, to know that they are real and true. So we don't keep them over, in some subject-object dualism. Again, I really strongly adhere to Patanjali's system of thought so that we fold them in. Therefore, we can open up into them. Because the more we keep them like as an object of knowledge, as opposed to doing the work, cleansing our own lens of perception. Again, the main idea being holding open that psychic abilities are there, but it's not necessarily something to aim for first. For sure, the healing of the mental, emotional body, that mind-body unity is carries a lot more weight, but staying open to the fact that psychic abilities are, and that clairvoyance and clairaudience are, I think it's really important for science to open up to that and not to continue to marginalize all that research. I don't know, just a note for any of your listeners who are curious about that. Russell Targ and the all the research that was done at SRI in the 70s and the 80s. There's a great documentary, Third Eye Spies, that talk a lot about psychic abilities to help people just really understand that they are here, and if we open up to them, we'll open up to a greater worldview. That's where that comes. It's like I said before about the academy, the Western Academy putting pure consciousness on the sidelines. It's also put psychic phenomena on the sidelines. And so in order to have a cultural or a paradigm shift, we have to open up the academy into these ideas, if you will.
And the foundation for that, those kind of activities, the foundation knowledge seems to be missing, the knowledge of pure consciousness. Like it kind of consolidates a lot of these things more like cleanly, like why these things are possible. And that basic, that foundational knowledge of the connectedness is missing because sometimes it's more focused on the activities than like what's behind those activities.
Yeah, the metaphysical foundation of a culture or a system of thought is really important. And Orthodox science, as she rolls, doesn't really acknowledge its own metaphysical foundation, you know, and at some point the subject, you know, even Patanjali uses a subject-object epistemology. He uses the subject, in loosely speaking, objectifying in order to get to know things and to move the mind around things. But at some level, that has to be dropped. And then that's how we take the deeper move into, again, the samyama or into non-duality. Because if everything continues to be objectified and put on the front of our eyes, again, that's the whole dualistic culture as she rolls. And I would say, from my own experience and point of view, that in and of itself is a cause of suffering. That's why people who are having spiritual breakthroughs are pathologized and put on psychotropic medicines, or worse, put it into psychiatric hospitals, because we don't have space for it. We don't know how to name it. We don't know how to soothe it. We don't know how to be present to it. And that's part because science and religion are so split. And then we try to address it, again, through medicines. And where do the medicines come from? Big Pharma. Well, what's Big Pharma doing? It's trading on Wall Street. I mean, it's a system as she rolls. And again, it's a whole particular silo that has a huge echo chamber. And until that, people who are within and you know, continuing to have that silo of thought continue to rotate and spin and swirl on its own axis, and until people who are within that silo really, you know, wake up on the cultural level, you know, otherwise it's you know, it's hard to have a dialogue.
Yeah, but it seems like there are like small openings for this dialogue to open up. People seem to be interested in these kind of dialogues now, which is a good sign.
Yeah, definitely.
And I wanted to ask this last question before we wrap up. I think some of the viewers may be able to relate to some of these things we discussed. Would you be open to share your own journey, your own exploration, how this transformation of consciousness unfolded for you and how it benefited you in your life?
Sure. I'm going to start with an experience that I had what's called in the religious studies literature a pure consciousness event. I'll start there. I was in a yoga room. I'd been practicing yoga for 6 months straight, probably about 5 days a week. I had meditated before that and done a little bit of yoga before that, but hadn't yet had a daily practice. and I had this is in 2000, I had what was known as a pure consciousness event. Lasted like a fraction of a second. It wasn't something I asked for. It was I never even had heard of these things. But all of a sudden, without a shadow of a doubt, I knew that consciousness is all there is, and that the subject-object distinction completely breaks down. I mean, it just... Now, why that happened, I can't say, because again, it's not something that I asked for. But it happened, and I lived with it for about 2 years, trying to place it. I read a book a week, actually, for 4 years straight on psyche and soul. That's where I really got into Jung and Patanjali. However, what it didn't do, it did not eradicate all the anxiety, what we call in Jungian psychology, we call them complexes, different patterns of thought and emotion that were like split off bits of my psyche. It didn't eradicate all that. So I had to basically try to match the worlds up. So that pure consciousness event was irrevocable. I mean, it sort of burnt certain psychic pathways. There was no going back to a form of duality. So all I could do was now take that experience and try to put it into perspective to everything I had lived up until that point. And of course, I'm continuing to live by having the dialogue with you. So I had to go back and look into those complexes and do all the Jungian shadow work, all the yogic work of sitting in my own mind and sitting in meditation and doing the pranayama and finding the places where a lot of it has to do with childhood bonding and, relationships within the family. And, these are key places, key things that happen to us early on that set our systems up to feel safe in social engagement or set us up to be more dysregulated and more uncomfortable within the collective. So I had to do all of that work, and I used both Jung and Patanjali, I would say, which is why I ended up writing the book, Consciousness in Jung and Patanjali, even though the book is more theoretical, as you know, and less on the practices. But, shadow work, so that internal turn of these places of suffering. Noticing when I would become dysregulated, using breath work and grounding tools, doing asana practice for years, still doing asana practice, still doing breath work. So I don't know if is that helpful or...
Yeah. And how did that benefit you in your life? Because sometimes some people, they have realization, but it again, they switch back to the old ways. Like it takes time to stabilize that non-dual realization. So I was just curious about your journey. Was that like a long process for you, and where you're at now?
Sure. So stabilizing the realization. I'm going to say again, mine was so strong that the knowing that pure consciousness is all there is never left. So in some sense, the insight was stabilized, but my psyche certainly wasn't, because I still had I was still working through the different complexes. I always say my son, like if anybody wants to know how clear my psyche is, don't ask me. Go to my 16-year-old son. I think our family, the people closest around us, really have the greatest insight, and motherhood means the world to me. I'm actually a single mother, and I've been a single mother the whole time, and I became a mother in 2008. So again, I had already had that pure consciousness event 8 years before, and still burning through patterns of mind as I developed into my motherhood, that my son was, if I could say, like the reason to do it, or just kept me on point, that I didn't want to repeat the errors of the past, that for whatever anxiety was in me because of what happened within my own family system, or that was never acknowledged, or that these things that I had to work through, I didn't want to put it into the next generation, even though my son is actually adopted, but it doesn't matter how I would mother him, obviously, and that being able to see him and soothe him and create safe space for, perhaps even more so because he's adopted. It meant everything to me. And if pure consciousness being all there is, again, it was that match. Really if I could say what was my work, matching the world in front of my eyes with the world behind it. And in front of, I mean really Patanjali's Prakriti, anything I could see or perceive, anything in my own system that would get dysregulated or out of alignment. And when I would parent in a way that was very unbecoming to, like, who I wanted to be or what, then my son really helped keep me on track, and still does. I never sit here and say, I'm fully cooked, because again, we're all in this together. This is something that's continuing to make its way perhaps into the collective, or throughout humanity, if we are to shift the paradigm, for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of an ongoing refinement, and we are just scratching the surface.
Right, that's right. Yeah. And I think refinement is such a great word. Balance. I think the words that we use, like I said, enlightenment carries so much baggage. It's like, words that don't have the kind of heaviness and are able to be, because most people are going to try to grasp it. It's the way we have learned to know in the West, is through grasping concepts. This is a shift that's really so big in so many ways, because it's about embodiment. It's about that, wait a minute, no. Okay, grasp it, yes. But what you're being invited to understand is that the knowing was in your body all along, and that you can look back to all those formative relationships with the primary caregiver. Were you seen? Were you soothed? Were you safe? And 40% of the population grows up in insecure family environments. There's a lot of people walking around the planet not feeling safe inside the human species or inside certain relationships. So, again, enlightenment, yes, but what we're looking for is balance, and finding where that balance was lost. And if it was lost in the family, and was the family lost to a cultural narrative that had never set us up for balance to begin with.
Yeah, it is a really big shift. And now, like, going back to that materialism-based psyche, it seems like such a big struggle. Like it would, after like tasting this sense of freedom, going back to that materialism-based world, I think it's really difficult. It's and also, like, it's not like once you have the realization, you won't have any pain or anything. But even if you have pain or fear, there's still a sense of freedom. There's something about the self-realization where even if there are some problems, you are still able to rest in that pure consciousness.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing to, like in chapter 1, Patanjali points to the Ritambhara Prajna, which is basically this imprint. So, like, if we're all seeking is at the heart of, I know I mentioned briefly affective neuroscience, and I really think it's like the most rich discipline of note in the way that it's studying the brain, and potentially Yak Pangsep, who's now crossed over, but he was really trying to point towards the soul, like looking towards the soul inside brain science. So there's your marriage there of science and religious experience. But Patanjali, he speaks to this Ritambhara Prajna. So if seeking is one of our 7 emotional primes, and we're seeking, brahmacharya, walking in the awareness of highest reality, being anchored in that source, or mother. I don't want to make it masculine, right? The Mother Earth, as she goes, Gaia. Patanjali speaks to this Rittambara Prajna at the end of chapter 1. It's like, and that's kind of what I feel like happened to me. Once that imprint gets known or realized, light put on it, to me, that's when there's no turning back, right? Because people talk about having like little awakenings, but then they fall asleep again. Or to me, it's like once that imprint is burnt, you can't go back from it.
Yeah, it's quite, and it's very like, it doesn't have to be like a magical experience. It's like, it can be like a simple, ordinary click, and it can change your whole life. It's so weird.
Yeah, it changes the whole directory.
Yeah.
Yeah. The whole direction of it. Absolutely. And back to this idea of the archetype as such, if, or Buddha or Patanjali, if that level of realization is meant to start pumping up more and more and more and more, because that's really the turn where the species is going, towards that level of realization, therefore sitting in cosmic mind, psychic abilities, then great. Hopefully with your beautiful channel and all the other beautiful YouTube channels like yours, it's just creating a safer space for people to, either be comfortable with the experiences that they've had, to get that kind of knowing that there's community out there, or that there's witnessing, and then from there, hopefully it gains more and more momentum.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to how all this unfolds, because it seems like slowly we are at least on YouTube, there is some space for people like you to open up and share this knowledge. I feel like next few years would be interesting to see how it all unfolds.
Yeah, exactly. It's giving a voice to the margins, right? Yeah.
I think what you have done is amazing, Leanne. Your work on integrating these two big thinkers, as well as integrating Eastern and Western philosophy. I'm so grateful for your work. It's very rare to find something like that. So thank you so much for giving like a synopsis of that in this interview. And I don't know if I missed anything, if you wanted to share anything today.
I think we covered lots of ground, and I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you for reaching out to me, and I'm so grateful that we've been able to share this time and have this dialogue. These dialogues are important, so thank you, for your channel and for all the information that you're, bringing to people of like mind who are interested in this material.
Thank you. And LeanneWhitney.com is your website if people want to reach out.
Yes, that's right. LeanneWhitney.com, yes.
And I also want to quickly thank the viewers. I will see you soon. Bye.